In the span of roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, European civilization came closer to extinction than most of us realize. Not from invading armies or natural disasters alone, but from choices made by the people themselves. Decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, practices woven into the fabric of daily life, beliefs held with absolute certainty. The medieval world was a place where the line between survival and collapse grew thin, worn down not by grand catastrophes, but by the accumulated weight of customs, superstitions, and systems that slowly turned against the very people they were meant to protect. Tonight, we'll explore 5 of the strangest ways medieval society brought itself to the edge of oblivion. These aren't tales of dramatic battles or legendary plagues, though those play their parts. Instead, these are stories of how ordinary life, when shaped by fear, tradition, and misunderstanding, can become its own worst enemy. So settle in, and let us journey back to a time when the world was both smaller and more dangerous, when humanity's greatest threat was often itself. The medieval mind saw symbolism everywhere, and in the eyes of many, particularly during the 13th and 14th centuries, cats represented something sinister. Their nocturnal habits, their independence, their gleaming eyes and darkness, all of this made them suspect. When the Catholic Church intensified its campaign against heresy and witchcraft, cats became entangled in the web of superstition. Pope Gregory IX issued a papal bull in 1233 that associated cats, particularly black ones, with devil worship and heretical sections. What followed was not an organized extermination, but a cultural shift. Across Europe, cats went from useful household animals to objects of suspicion and persecution. In towns and villages, cats were killed in various ways. Some communities incorporated cat burning into their festivals, believing it would ward off evil spirits. In Metz, France, dozens of cats were burned in cages during midsummer celebrations. In other places, cats were thrown from church towers or hunted for sport. The practice varied by region, but the result was consistent. The population of cats across medieval Europe declined dramatically. This wasn't a sudden purge, but a gradual erosion spanning generations, as cultural attitudes turned against these animals. For a time, few noticed any consequences. Life continued as it always had. Grain was stored, markets functioned, seasons turned. But the medieval world was built on a delicate balance, and removing one piece of that balance would eventually exact a price. That price came in the form of rats. Without cats to keep their numbers in check, rat populations exploded. The black rat, in particular, thrived in medieval towns and cities, where waste management was primitive and grain stores abundant. These rats lived in the thatched roofs, in the walls, in the storage areas of every home and shop. They were everywhere, and their numbers grew unchecked. The rats themselves were not the danger. It was what they carried. In the fleas that infested their fur lived a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. When the plague arrived in Europe in 1347, arriving on ships from the east, it found a continent perfectly prepared to receive it. The rat population provided an ideal vector for the disease to spread. From port cities, it moved along trade routes, carried by infected rats and their fleas. Within 5 years, the Black Death had killed an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population. The exact relationship between cat persecution and the severity of the plague is debated by historians. Some regions that killed fewer cats did not fare significantly better. The plague was a complex phenomenon, influenced by trade, climate, sanitation, and numerous other factors. But the correlation is striking enough to warrant reflection. Medieval society, in its zeal to purify itself of perceived evil, had removed one of its best defenses against actual catastrophe. The towns that suffered most severely were often those with the highest population densities and the worst sanitation, conditions that favored rats. In London, Paris, and Florence, the death toll was staggering. Entire neighborhoods were emptied. Bodies piled in the streets faster than they could be buried. The social order collapsed in places. Fields went unplanted, shops closed, knowledge was lost as craftsmen and scholars died without passing on their skills. In the aftermath, some regions began to see value in cats again. Practical concerns overrode superstition in the face of such devastating loss. But the damage had been done. Medieval Europe had learned, at tremendous cost, that every part of the natural world serves a purpose, even the parts we don't understand or don't like. The cat persecutions remind us that beliefs, even widely held ones, can be catastrophically wrong. Medieval people were not stupid or primitive. They were doing what they thought was right, acting on the best understanding they had of the world. But they were operating with incomplete information, guided by fear and superstition rather than observation and reason. In removing cats from their world, they removed a check on the rat population, and in doing so, they helped create the conditions for one of history's greatest disasters. It's a reminder that our relationship with the natural world is more interconnected than we often realize, and that disrupting that balance, even with the best intentions, can have consequences beyond our ability to imagine. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into the narrow street outside her home and began to dance. She danced alone, without music, moving in a frenzied, uncontrolled manner. She danced for hours, and when night fell, she continued dancing. By the next day, she was still dancing, her feet bleeding, her body exhausted but unable to stop. Within a week, dozens of others had joined her. Then hundreds. The streets of Strasbourg filled with people dancing wildly, uncontrollably, their faces twisted in expressions of anguish and exhaustion. They danced through the day and into the night, many collapsing from exhaustion, some dying from heart attacks, strokes, or sheer physical exhaustion. Historical records suggest that, at the height of the dancing plague, up to 400 people were affected. This was not an isolated incident. Similar outbreaks had occurred across Europe since the 14th century, though the Strasbourg event of 1518 was the most severe and best documented. In each case, the pattern was similar: one person would begin dancing, others would join, and the dancing would continue for days or weeks, sometimes claiming lives. The medieval response to these dancing plagues reveals much about how society understood illness and affliction. Local authorities and physicians initially believed the dancing was caused by hot blood, an imbalance of the humors that could be cured by more dancing. They hired musicians and opened guild halls to give the dancers more space, believing that allowing them to dance continuously would eventually exhaust the affliction. This intervention, intended to help, may have actually prolonged the outbreak and encouraged more people to join. Modern historians and medical experts have proposed various explanations. Some suggest ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, which can cause convulsions and hallucinations. Others point to mass psychogenic illness, a psychological phenomenon where physical symptoms spread through a population in response to stress. Medieval life provided plenty of stress. Famine, disease, religious anxiety, and social upheaval were constants. The dancing may have been a way for that accumulated stress to manifest. But perhaps the most compelling explanation involves the medieval understanding of punishment and divine displeasure. The region had a strong tradition of belief in Saint Vitus, a saint associated with dancing and neurological disorders. According to legend, those who angered Saint Vitus could be cursed with uncontrollable dancing. In a society where religious belief permeated every aspect of life, where the line between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin, such a curse would have been terrifyingly real. The afflicted may have believed so strongly in the curse that their bodies responded accordingly. Once the dancing began, the sight of others in the grip of the same affliction would have reinforced the belief, spreading it through the community like a contagion of the mind. The authorities, by treating it as a physical ailment requiring physical remedy, may have inadvertently validated and strengthened the belief. What makes the dancing plagues particularly tragic is how they reveal the power of collective belief to create physical reality. These people were not faking their symptoms. They danced until they collapsed, until their feet bled, until their hearts gave out. They were genuinely suffering, trapped in their own bodies by beliefs so deeply held that they became corporeal. The dancing plagues also highlight the dangers of responding to psychological crises with inappropriate interventions. By encouraging more dancing, authorities prolonged the suffering. By treating a psychological phenomenon as a purely physical ailment, they missed the opportunity to address the underlying causes, the stress, fear, and religious anxiety that plagued medieval communities. The outbreaks eventually subsided, though not before claiming numerous lives. In Strasbourg, the dancing continued for over a month before gradually fading away. Some of those affected recovered. Others died. The city was left to make sense of what had happened, to incorporate this strange episode into their understanding of the world. In the end, the dancing plagues stand as a testament to the power of the mind, to the ways that belief and social contagion can manifest in physical suffering. Medieval society, lacking the psychological understanding we have today, could only respond with the tools and knowledge available to them. But in doing so, they sometimes made things worse, turning what might have been a brief episode into a prolonged catastrophe. It's a reminder that how we respond to crisis matters as much as the crisis itself, and that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from the affliction but from our misunderstanding of it. There's a persistent image of the medieval period as universally dirty, a time when no one bathed and streets ran with filth. Like many stereotypes, this contains both truth and exaggeration. The reality is more complex and more interesting. The medieval relationship with bathing changed over time, and in that change, we can see how cultural shifts and religious beliefs combine to create genuinely dangerous living conditions. In the early medieval period, particularly before the 12th century, bathing was relatively common. Public bathhouses existed in many towns, continuing a tradition inherited from the Romans. These bathhouses served both hygienic and social functions. People gathered to bathe, to socialize, to conduct business. Hot baths were understood to be healthful, cleansing not just the body but promoting overall well-being. But over time, attitudes shifted. The change began with concerns about morality. Bathhouses had developed reputations as places of vice. Men and women sometimes bathed together. The warm, intimate environment encouraged behavior that the increasingly powerful church found objectionable. Bathhouses were associated with prostitution, drinking, and various forms of moral corruption. As the church's influence grew, so did the pressure to close these establishments, or severely restrict their use. Then came the plague. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, physicians and scholars scrambled to understand how it spread. One theory that gained traction was that bathing opened the pores, making the body more vulnerable to corrupted air, which many believed was the source of disease. Hot baths, once thought healthful, were now considered dangerous. The very act of bathing, of opening one's pores to the air, could invite in the pestilence. This fear was compounded by religious interpretations. Some religious thinkers began to argue that excessive attention to the body, including bathing, was a form of vanity and self-indulgence. The truly holy should be concerned with the soul, not the flesh. Filth became associated with piety. Saints were praised for never bathing, for mortifying their flesh through deliberate uncleanliness. What had once been a sign of poverty and deprivation became, in some circles, a badge of spiritual superiority. The practical effects of these beliefs were profound. Public bathhouses closed or fell into disrepair. Private bathing became rare. By the 15th and 16th centuries, many people in Europe might go months or even years without a full bath. They would wash their hands and faces, change their undergarments, but complete immersion in water became increasingly unusual. The consequences for public health were severe. Without regular bathing, skin diseases flourished. Lice were ubiquitous, spreading typhus. The lack of general cleanliness contributed to the spread of numerous infectious diseases. Streets and homes accumulated waste. Chamber pots were empty from windows. The smell must have been overwhelming, though people became accustomed to it. Ironically, the very measures meant to protect against disease, avoiding bathing to keep pores closed, likely made disease more common and more severe. The dirt and grime that accumulated on unwashed bodies provided ideal conditions for parasites and pathogens. The lack of public sanitation that accompanied the decline of bathing culture meant that diseases spread more easily through communities. It's worth noting that not everyone abandoned bathing entirely. Practices varied by region, social class, and individual belief. Some areas maintained bathing traditions longer than others. The wealthy sometimes had private bathing facilities. But the overall trend was clear: Europe became dirtier, and that filth carried consequences. The situation began to improve only slowly, over centuries. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical learning, including Roman ideas about hygiene. The scientific revolution of the 17th century began to challenge medieval medical theories. But even into the 18th century, regular bathing was far from universal in Europe. What makes this episode particularly striking is how a practice that was genuinely beneficial, regular bathing, came to be seen as dangerous and even sinful. Medieval people weren't being irrational by their own lights. They were responding to what they believed about disease transmission, to the teachings of religious authorities they trusted, to their observations of the world around them. But they were wrong, and their error cost countless lives. The story of medieval bathing is a reminder of how fragile progress can be, how easily knowledge can be lost or deliberately abandoned. It shows how moral concerns can become entangled with public health in ways that harm both. And it demonstrates that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from ignorance of what's right, but from the certainty that what's wrong is actually correct. Medieval society didn't accidentally become dirtier. It made a choice, based on what it believed about the world, and that choice nearly proved catastrophic. Of all medieval medical practices, few are as infamous as bloodletting, yet few are as misunderstood. The practice of deliberately removing blood from the sick was not an isolated peculiarity but rather the cornerstone of medieval medicine, rooted in theories inherited from the ancient world and applied with unwavering conviction for over 1,000 years. To understand how bloodletting nearly destroyed medieval society, we must first understand why it made perfect sense to those who practiced it. The theory behind bloodletting came from the ancient Greek physician Galen, whose works dominated medieval medicine. Galen taught that the body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on these humors remaining in balance. Illness was thought to result from an excess or deficiency of one or more humors. Since blood was considered the most important humor, and since many illnesses involved fever, inflammation, or redness, all associated with blood, it followed logically that removing excess blood would restore balance and cure disease. This wasn't pseudoscience by medieval standards. It was the cutting edge of medical knowledge, practiced by the most educated physicians, taught in universities, and supported by centuries of tradition. When a person fell ill, the physician would assess their symptoms, determine which humor was in excess, and prescribe the appropriate treatment. For most ailments, that treatment involved bloodletting. The methods varied. Sometimes blood was drawn by opening a vein with a lancet, a practice called venesection. Other times, leeches were applied to the skin to draw out blood gradually. Cupping was also common, where heated cups were placed on the skin to create suction and draw blood to the surface. The amount of blood removed could be substantial, pints rather than ounces, amounts that would leave the patient weak and dizzy. For a person already weakened by illness, losing large quantities of blood was catastrophic. The practice didn't cure disease, it compounded the problem. Someone suffering from pneumonia or influenza needed rest, nutrition, and time to heal. Instead, they received a treatment that further weakened their body, reduced their ability to fight infection, and often hastened their death. The tragedy deepened because bloodletting was applied universally. Children were bled. Pregnant women were bled. The elderly were bled. Those recovering from injuries were bled. No condition seemed to fall outside bloodletting's purview. Headaches, fevers, infections, digestive complaints, mental disturbances, all received the same treatment. If the patient failed to improve, the solution was often to bleed them again, more aggressively. Some of the most prominent figures in medieval history died from or were severely harmed by bloodletting. King Charles II of England was bled repeatedly during his final illness in 1685, with physicians removing pints of blood over several days. Modern analysis suggests the bloodletting itself may have killed him, or at least hastened his death. George Washington, though living after the medieval period, died in 1799 after physicians removed nearly half his blood volume in an attempt to cure a throat infection. The practice persisted well into the 19th century. What makes bloodletting particularly insidious is that it sometimes appeared to work. A person with high blood pressure might feel temporary relief after bloodletting, as the reduction in blood volume would lower their blood pressure. Someone with inflammation might experience a placebo effect, feeling better because they believed the treatment would help. These occasional apparent successes reinforced belief in the practice, even as it killed countless others. The broader social impact was immense. Bloodletting didn't just fail to cure the sick, it actively harmed them, increasing mortality rates from treatable conditions. It created a medical system where seeking help often made things worse. Physicians, the very people society trusted to heal the sick, were inadvertently contributing to the death toll of diseases and injuries that might otherwise have been survivable. Moreover, the dominance of bloodletting stifled medical progress. Because the practice was so firmly rooted in accepted theory, questioning it meant challenging the entire framework of medieval medicine. Physicians who observed that bloodletting seemed to harm patients faced a difficult choice: trust their observations or trust the wisdom of centuries. Most chose tradition. The few who questioned bloodletting were often dismissed or marginalized. This created a system where medical knowledge couldn't advance because the fundamental theory was wrong, yet challenging that theory was nearly impossible. Medieval medicine became trapped in a closed loop, where practice reinforced theory and theory justified practice, even as patients died from the very treatments meant to save them. The decline of bloodletting came slowly, driven by advances in understanding of anatomy, physiology, and disease. The discovery of blood circulation in the 17th century, the development of germ theory in the 19th century, and the gradual accumulation of evidence against bloodletting finally undermined the practice. But the transition took centuries, during which millions suffered and died needlessly. The story of bloodletting is ultimately a story about the danger of certainty. Medieval physicians weren't trying to harm their patients. They genuinely believed they were helping, acting on the best knowledge available to them. But that knowledge was wrong, and their certainty about its rightness prevented them from seeing the truth. In a society where medicine could kill as surely as disease, where the learned were as dangerous as the ignorant, the line between healing and harming disappeared entirely. It's a sobering reminder that good intentions, backed by impressive credentials and ancient authority, can still lead to catastrophe when the underlying assumptions are flawed. In the medieval world, healing was a complicated affair. Official medicine, practiced by university-trained physicians, was expensive and largely ineffective. For the vast majority of people, healthcare came from local healers, women and men who possessed practical knowledge of herbs, treatments, and remedies passed down through generations. These folk healers were the primary source of medical care for most of the population, and medieval society nearly destroyed them. The persecution of folk healers, particularly women healers, intensified during the late medieval period and reached its peak in the early modern witch trials, but its roots ran deep into medieval culture. The Church had long been suspicious of healers who operated outside its authority. Healing, like so much else, was supposed to be mediated through religious institutions. Folk healers, with their practical knowledge and local authority, represented a challenge to that control. The suspicion had multiple sources. Folk healers used herbs and natural substances, knowledge that seemed mysterious to those who didn't possess it. They were often successful where official medicine failed, which raised uncomfortable questions about the value of expensive university training. Many healers were women, operating in a realm of expertise and authority that made male religious and medical authorities uncomfortable. And their methods often incorporated elements that the Church considered superstitious or pagan: charms, incantations, rituals that predated Christianity. As the medieval period progressed, particularly after the 14th century, these suspicions hardened into active persecution. Healers were increasingly accused of witchcraft. Their knowledge of herbs became evidence of dealing with dark powers. Their ability to cure diseases that baffled official physicians became proof of supernatural intervention. Success itself became suspicious. The most systematic persecutions came with the witch trials, which peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries but had medieval roots. Women healers were particularly vulnerable. Historical records from witch trials show that many of the accused were known healers, midwives, or herbalists. Their crime, often, was simply being too successful at healing, or being consulted when official medicine failed. The trials followed a predictable pattern. A healer would be accused, often by someone whose relative had died despite, or because of, treatment. Under torture, the accused might confess to impossible crimes, meeting with the devil, cursing crops, causing illness through magic. These confessions, extracted through unimaginable pain, would then be used to justify execution. Burning was common, though hanging and other methods were also used. The loss to medieval society was incalculable. Each executed healer represented years of accumulated knowledge, erased in an afternoon. The remedies they knew, the treatments that actually worked, died with them. Surviving healers learned to keep their knowledge hidden, to practice in secret, to avoid drawing attention. The result was a dramatic reduction in available healthcare for common people, precisely at a time when disease was rampant. Consider what was lost. Folk healers knew which plants could reduce fever, which could ease pain, which could help with childbirth. Some of this knowledge was later rediscovered by modern medicine: willow bark for pain relief, foxglove for heart conditions, ergot for inducing labor. But in the medieval period, that knowledge was deliberately destroyed, and people suffered for it. The persecution also created a perverse situation where dangerous practitioners could flourish while skilled healers were eliminated. A genuine healer, with a reputation for success, was more likely to be accused of witchcraft than a charlatan who failed more often. The witch trials selected against competence, removing the most effective healers and leaving behind those who were less successful and thus less suspicious. Moreover, the persecutions created an atmosphere of fear that discouraged the development and sharing of medical knowledge. Why would anyone spend years learning herbal remedies if success might lead to accusations of witchcraft? Why would healers pass their knowledge to apprentices if doing so might endanger both teacher and student? The natural process of knowledge transmission, by which practical wisdom passed from one generation to the next, was disrupted. The impact extended beyond individual healers. Entire communities lost access to medical care. In rural areas, where the nearest university-trained physician might be days away and unaffordable besides, the local healer was the only source of medical help. When that person was arrested, tried, and executed, the community was left without any medical resources at all. It's difficult to quantify how many died because effective healers were eliminated, but the number must have been substantial. Women who would have survived childbirth with a skilled midwife's help died in agony. Children with treatable fevers perished for lack of simple herbal remedies. Injuries that a healer could have dressed and treated became infected and fatal. The great irony is that official medicine, the system that helped drive the persecution of folk healers, had so little to offer in their place. University-trained physicians had their bloodletting and their theories, but they lacked the practical knowledge that folk healers possessed. They couldn't deliver babies as safely as experienced midwives. They didn't know which plants actually worked to reduce fever or fight infection. By destroying folk medicine in the name of proper authority and religious purity, medieval society made itself sicker and more vulnerable. The recovery of this lost knowledge would take centuries. Some remedies were preserved in monasteries, where monks maintained herb gardens and copied medical texts. Some survived through oral tradition, passed secretly within families despite the risks. But much was simply lost forever, knowledge that took generations to accumulate, destroyed in a few decades of paranoid persecution. In the end, the persecution of healers stands as perhaps the clearest example of how medieval society endangered itself through its own actions. Here was no ignorance about cats and rats, no psychological contagion of dancing, no mistaken medical theory. This was deliberate, systematic destruction of knowledge and expertise, driven by institutional jealousy, religious zealotry, and the fear of anything that couldn't be controlled or understood. Medieval people made themselves sicker, shortened their own lives, and suffered more than necessary, all in the name of eliminating a threat that existed mostly in their own imagination. The healers weren't the danger. The persecution of healers was the danger, and by the time society recognized this, generations of knowledge had already been lost. The medieval period stretched across 1,000 years, encompassing countless lives, cultures, and experiences. It gave us great cathedrals and universities, philosophical insights and artistic achievements. But it also demonstrates how societies can endanger themselves through their own beliefs and practices, how the line between self-preservation and self-destruction can become blurred. The examples we've explored tonight, the persecution of cats, the dancing plagues, the abandonment of bathing, the practice of bloodletting, and the destruction of folk medicine, share common threads. Each involved practices that seemed reasonable at the time, supported by authority, tradition, or both. Each was undertaken with the sincere belief that it was the right thing to do. And each brought medieval society closer to collapse. These weren't inevitable disasters, acts of God or nature beyond human control. They were choices, made by people trying to make sense of their world with the tools and knowledge they possessed. That those choices proved catastrophic doesn't mean medieval people were foolish. It means they were human, subject to the same limitations we face: incomplete information, cultural biases, the weight of tradition, the pressure to conform. The medieval world survived these dangers, though not without tremendous cost. Populations recovered from the plagues. Knowledge was eventually regained. Society adapted and changed. But the cost in lives, in suffering, in lost potential, was enormous. And the lessons remain relevant. We still make decisions based on incomplete information. We still follow practices because they're traditional, even when evidence suggests they might be harmful. We still trust authority, sometimes beyond what's warranted. We're still capable of collective beliefs that become collective dangers. The medieval period is distant now, but the dynamics that nearly destroyed medieval society are timeless. As we consider these stories from centuries past, perhaps the most important lesson is the value of questioning, of observation, of being willing to challenge even deeply held beliefs when evidence suggests they might be wrong. Medieval society struggled with this. The weight of tradition and authority made questioning difficult, often dangerous. Those who challenged accepted wisdom risked being marginalized or worse. But it was those questioners, eventually, who helped move society forward. The people who noticed that cats might actually be useful, who recognized that bathing was healthful, who questioned bloodletting, who defended folk healers, these were the voices that gradually, slowly, across generations, helped medieval society step back from the edge. The medieval world was strange and distant, a place where beliefs and practices would seem alien to us now. But in its struggles to survive its own customs and convictions, we can see reflections of challenges that persist. The methods change, the specifics differ, but the fundamental question remains: how do we build a society that can recognize when its own practices have become dangers, that can change course before the cost becomes catastrophic. The medieval period doesn't offer complete answers, but it offers something valuable, evidence that societies can endanger themselves through their own actions, and that recognizing this danger is the first step toward survival. In that recognition lies hope, the possibility that we can do better, learn faster, adapt more readily than our predecessors. The strange and nearly fatal practices of medieval society can teach us, if we're willing to listen, if we're willing to question, if we're willing to learn from the past even as we build a different future. And so our journey through medieval dangers comes to an end. The world has changed dramatically since then, become larger and smaller simultaneously, filled with different challenges and different dangers. But the human capacity for both wisdom and folly remains constant, as does our ability to choose which one we'll follow. May we choose more wisely than those who came before, and may we remember their struggles as we face our own. Sleep well, knowing that however strange our modern world may seem, it is built on the lessons learned from those medieval centuries, when humanity nearly wiped itself out in the strangest of ways, yet somehow found the resilience to endure.